Today is the last lecture of the lecture series called The Question of Land, sadly. We had 3 previous lectures, which you can watch. I think most of them should be now in the AA YouTube channel. One lecture by Jane Houghton on reciprocal landscapes, another one by Billy Fleming on the Green New Deal, designing the Green New Deal, and last one last week by Troy Betes, Drew Pendergrass, and Philip Mesco on designing the half Earth. All been quite interesting and amazing lectures, so please look at them. But today we'll finalize with Kai Heron, who kindly accepted our invitation to be part of this. And obviously we're looking forward to what he has to say about the question of land. The series have been focusing on this, the land, as an intersection of the various crises that we are living today. And so we've been exploring that from various perspectives, and there've been a lot of ideas about how those crises can be tackled. But today, Kai Heron is presenting us with a lecture called Averting Capitalist Catastrophism, with the idea of renewing the land question in the UK. So this lecture proposes that the global North's response to COVID-19 and the climate crisis reveals a new form of capitalism in the making, which is called capitalist catastrophism. The lecture explains this concept, why the green capitalism of Labour's Green New Deal and the conservatives' Green Industrial Revolution are not enough to avert ecological breakdown, and why the issue of who owns the land, how they own it, and for what ends ought to be at the center of struggles for ecological and social justice in the UK and beyond. So Kai Heron is a casualized academic based in Manchester, UK, and he is the editor, an editor at Roar magazine, and lectures at the University of Manchester. He maintains research interest in the political theory, political ecology, psychoanalysis, and political economy. So please help me to welcome Kai Heron, and thank you very much for joining us here. I don't know if the first time you're lecturing in a school of architecture, but well, yes, okay, so that's good. Yep. I hope it will be very interesting for both, and hopefully we can have a interesting conversation.
Yes, great. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I want to start by thanking the Architects Association. I've never presented to a group like this, so I'm really excited to see what kinds of conversations we can have. I also want to thank Alfredo in particular for inviting me. It really is a pleasure. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is a little bit different to that lecture summary that I gave, but only in one respect. My plan was to introduce you to this concept of capitalist catastrophism that I've been working on for a while, and then leverage that to make a critique of the Labour Party's Green New Deal and the Tories' Green Agenda as a way to kind of reopen the land question in the UK. But I've decided I don't really want to get bogged down in critiquing green capitalism, green imperialism, and parliamentary politics. And the reason for that is even in the time since I submitted that application, the way environmental politics in the UK is being thought about has changed quite a bit. So Starmer's leadership has basically abandoned the Corbynite Green New Deal. And just this week, a parliamentary report concluded that the Tories have no plan in place to implement their green agenda. So I want to kind of put our attention elsewhere. And instead, I'm going to introduce you to the idea of capitalist catastrophism. Then I'm going to move immediately to reopening the land question in the UK on agrarian, on some kind of ecological, anti-imperialist and internationalist grounds. And my hope is that this idea of capitalist catastrophism can change the way we think about the land question. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you about that. Before any of that, though, today is International Women's Day. So I want to raise that and say that it's a day of militant celebration in Alexander Kollontai's words. So let me begin by extending solidarity to women everywhere who are fighting for a world free of domination, and by acknowledging the often underappreciated labor of women. Since I'm going to be speaking about land and agriculture, it's also worth mentioning that most of the agricultural work done in the world today is still by women, and that women will therefore be on the front lines of struggles around land. Especially if you look at the farmers' protests in India, they've been integral to the way that that protest is going. So yeah, there's that. And finally, let me thank the women in my own life who have helped me be here. My wife, Sarah, who's listened to all of this, endlessly while I've been writing it. My mum, my friends, and my comrades. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if it works. Okay. Hopefully you can all see this. I've got nods. Good. Let me turn off. Okay. Let me start. So something is badly wrong with capitalism today, not just for those of us who want it to end, but also increasingly for its architects, managers, and devotees. The list of capital's accumulated morbid symptoms, to use Gramsci's language, is a long one. Secular stagnation, ballooning surplus populations, zoonotic spillovers, deepening planetary inequalities, escalating global rebellions, a resurgent far right, an uncertain and profoundly uneven COVID vaccination process, and economic recovery. And subtending and exacerbating all of that, a burgeoning and irreversible ecological crisis of truly catastrophic proportions. If the left and right agree on one thing at the moment, it's that something will have to give. Even before the pandemic, the Financial Times featured a headline calling for capitalism to be given a reset. After it, Western governments have promised to build back better, to build back greener, or level up. Each phrase is a kind of muffled admission that the social compromise between workers and capital in the global north, forged through the exploitation of nature and the labor of the global south, is all but disintegrated. Even sectors of international capital are starting to lose faith in their own messaging. So in September 2020, Deutsche Bank published this really interesting report called The Age of Disorder. Fronted dramatically by this image of a volcanic eruption and a volley of lightning across a brooding sky, the report finds that the global economy is on the precipice of a phase shift from neoliberal quasi-stability into an era of intense social, economic, and ecological upheaval. From Deutsche Bank's perspective, so from the perspective of finance capital, the period from 1980 to 2020 was what they called a golden age of prosperity. In what they call a win-win for most of the globe, the bank points to the supposed economic benefits of the period's low inflation, increasing asset prices, favorable returns on bonds and equity, and depressed wages and worker militancy. In the world of Deutsche Bank, the 2008 financial crash is a distant memory. They maybe mention it 4 or 5 times in the report. And the ongoing immiseration of the global south and deterioration of the natural world are bugs, not features of capital accumulation. Hastened by COVID-19 and the climate crisis, Deutsche Bank's report warns that the age of prosperity is coming to an end. And then in years to come, they write, when we look in the rearview mirror, we may see 2020 as the start of a new era, an era that they call the age of disorder, and that I've taken to calling capitalist catastrophism. So with the report's publication, Deutsche Bank joined a chorus of voices on both the left and right that were forewarning of the end of neoliberalism again, and the emergence of a new and unpredictable stage in the way that capital organizes our lives. In the pandemic's early months in particular, people turned time and again to Gramsci to illustrate that point. This is that well-known quote of his: "The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying, but the new cannot be born. In the interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." So this passage is usually used to evoke the idea that we exist in a kind of volatile interim between two states, that the uncertainty, anxiety, and horror of the present are a passing phase on the path to something new, and we hope something better. But what happens if we cut away the implicit teleology of this aphorism and imagine that the interregnum is the new normal for the foreseeable future? What if the new really cannot be born? If history's dialectical unfolding has been interrupted in a way that is strikingly similar to how Fanon describes the colonial condition? How would the realization that this great variety of morbid symptoms that I've listed at the beginning of the lecture are not going to go anywhere and are in fact only going to get worse change how we act in the world? Those are the kinds of questions I'm trying to pose with capitalist catastrophism. So as the name implies, capitalist catastrophism has its roots in Mark Fisher's theory of capitalist realism. If you're familiar with that idea, bear with me for a second. I'm just going to try and summarize it quickly. For Fisher, capitalist realism describes, quote, the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is now almost impossible to imagine a coherent alternative to it. Fisher developed the concept in the years and months preceding the 2008 financial crash, consciously incorporating Francis Fukuyama's end of history thesis, and an oft-repeated maxim attributed to Slavoj Žižek and Frederick Jameson, that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. In fact, according to Fisher, this phrase captures precisely what he means by capitalist realism, but I think that that's a kind of inaccurate self-assessment. As his argument unfolded across blog posts, lectures, and ultimately a book, Fisher's understanding of capitalist realism began to acquire more all-encompassing, almost ontological valence. To borrow a phrase from Raymond Williams, it became a shared structure of feeling. It was impersonal, comprehensive, unconscious, and insidious. Capitalist realism named the naturalization of neoliberalism as an ineradicable fact of our lives. For better or worse, this idea has been wildly popular. It's been picked up and redeployed to describe times and places that are very different from the miserable realities of New Labour Britain that Fisher was contending with. But the question for us, and the question I started thinking at the beginning of the pandemic, was whether this idea really applies in our world today, racked as it is by epidemiological and ecological catastrophe. I think there's a case to be made that it does, and that it would go a little bit like this. The Corbyn and Sanders projects have put what Keir Milburn called a crack in capitalist realism, a crack through which a flood of post-capitalist desires have burst. They might have shown for a brief while that another world is possible, but they were ultimately defeated, and the subsequent pandemic response in the global north has thrown us viciously back into this world, a world where capital reigns supreme, where it's not inconceivable to let people die so that capital might live, where, for instance, it's largely unremarked upon that the Conservatives' decision to lift lockdown restrictions in summer or promote the Eat Out to Help Out scheme caused tens of thousands of preventable deaths. There was, it seems, no alternative to this. The economy was hurting. Capitalist realism persists. So against that interpretation, I want to suggest that we're not really in capitalist realism anymore, that we've been leaving it for some time, and that the signs of what might replace it in our pandemic-ridden and rapidly warming world are increasingly apparent. Unless there's a radical break with capitalism, what will replace it is not a global Green New Deal, or the ability to fight for and imagine post-capitalist futures, but something more ambiguous and perhaps worse that I call capitalist catastrophism. So capitalist catastrophism is what happens when capitalist realism begins to fray at the edges. It describes a situation in which capital can no longer determine what it means to be realistic, not because of the forces of social movements that are assembled against it, but because capital's self-undermining and ecologically destructive dynamics have outstripped the state and capital's capacity to control them. I think we can see signs of this in the way that capital and state have played catch-up with COVID as it leaps across borders, mutates, and burns through populations. I think we can also see signs of it in the Australian wildfires that started 2020 by killing more than 478 people, the wildfires that hit the east coast of the US late last summer, which is where this picture is from, the typhoon that killed 42 people in the Philippines, the flash floods that killed more than 150 in Afghanistan, Hurricane Eta that killed more than 150 in Central America, and all of that was just last year. This year, we've already seen blackouts in Texas and a slab of glacier break off from the Indian Himalayas, killing more than 49 people and leaving 155 missing. Okay, but these are just some of the effects of over a century of Euro-American fossil fuel-propelled plunder, violence, and accumulation. But it's also a list that gives undue emphasis to the staccato pattern of spectacular headline-grabbing climatic events. capitalist catastrophism is also characterized by the accumulation of what Rob Nixon calls the slow violence of ecological degradation. This is violence that, as he writes, is neither spectacular nor instantaneous, but rather incremental and accretive, its calamitous repercussions playing out across a range of temporal scales. We should think here of sacrifice zones, soil and nitrogen depletion, ocean acidification, rising sea levels, the long-term intergenerational effects of toxins and pollutants. Unlike capitalist realism, capitalist catastrophism is not a coherent social formation. It is not an ideological project. It is the unmaking of one. It is the unraveling of capitalist realism set into motion by the catastrophic convergence, to borrow Christian Parenti's phrase, of climate breakdown, a global pandemic, capital's declining profitability, the last of which has been persuasively demonstrated by EndNote's Aaron Benanav and Jason Smith, but which I'm not going to touch on in this presentation. So how does capitalist catastrophism differ from capitalist realism? For Fisher, capitalist realism had three essential features. First, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Second, that the future is cancelled. And third, that capitalist realist condition is a class project in need of constant reinforcement by capitalist states, ideology, and wage discipline. Under capitalist catastrophism, those features don't disappear so much as mutate and adopt new forms. So what I'm going to do now is run through those in turn. Beginning with the first one, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Okay, so under capitalist realism, not only was it easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, but we enjoyed imagining the end of the world. Dystopic film and fiction proliferated. So there's Armageddon, 2012, The Day After Tomorrow, Melancholia, Black Mirror, The Road, Handmaid's Tale, the list is almost endless. However bad things were, these films and TV shows reminded us that they were at least not that bad. They created what Frederick Jameson calls a nostalgia for the present. The end of the world might have passed for entertainment under capitalist realism, but one of my wages is that for us now, it's all too real. Under capitalist catastrophism, we no longer need to imagine the end of the world. We watch it in real time, we read about it on our social media feeds, and we take to the streets to protest it, or at least we used to. According to the International Panel on Climate Change, the world's governments have less than 10 years to respond to the crisis if we're to avoid more than 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. By some estimates, it's already too late. Dwindling insect numbers threaten what's been called a total collapse of nature. Human-made materials now outweigh the Earth's entire biomass, and scientists are discovering that even their worst-case scenarios were not bad enough. As the Salvage editorial group put it, in today's world, climate mitigation and climate adaptation have become the same thing. Closing fossil fuel plants, shutting down industrialized agribusiness, abolishing class and the value form have become just sensible adaptations to ecological crisis. From this point on, the climate struggle is not just about saving the environment, which was the kind of messaging I got growing up, but rather about how much of it we will lose, how many of us will die, and how those of us who are left will adapt. So Fisher thought that capitalist realism could only be toppled if, quote, it is shown to be in some way inconsistent or untenable, if, that is to say, capitalism's ostensible realism was nothing of the sort. Under capitalist catastrophism, I think we're beginning to reach that point. As Deutsche Bank's report shows us, austerity, escalating global inequalities, and the imperialist cause response to both the climate crisis and coronavirus has started to eat away at the fiction of capitalism's compatibility with human and non-human survival. There's nothing consistent about destroying entire crops when there are mile-long food bank lines, as we saw at the early days of the pandemic, and as we saw again in November in Dallas. There's nothing tenable about Shell expanding their natural gas operations by 20% as part of their supposed decarbonization policy, as they announced last month. And there's nothing realistic about green capitalism's faith in the idea that so-called green growth can be made compatible with the climate crisis. So this increased visibility of capital's kind of cruel irrationality has given rise to what I think is one of the clearest signs at least as working as a political theorist, that capitalist realism is not around anymore, that we're beginning to break out of it. It's no longer easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. In just the past few years, the left has presented an abundance of post-capitalist imaginaries, and I'll list just a few. So we have Green New Deal transitions, degrowth futures, eco-modernist utopias, fully automated luxury communism, decolonized agroecological matrices, half-earth socialism, as you heard from last week, and even supposedly left-wing neo-feudalisms in the form of a so-called small farm future. I think in many ways, the left's powers of imagination over a period in the 17th and 18th century, the kind of utopian moment that was in equal parts praised and lambasted by Marx and Engels. At this early point in capital's development, when the proletariat was what Marx called still in a very undeveloped state, Marx and Engels believed that the fantastic pictures and utopian musings of thinkers like Fourier, Saint-Simon, and Cabet indicated what they called the first instinctive yearnings of that class, by which they meant the working class, for the general reconstruction of society. It could be that after decades of capitalist realism, the authors of today's speculative fictions, futures are beginning to play a similar role. But if this is the case, we should remember that for Marx and Engels, the yawning gap between the utopians' idyllic visions and the social relations that confronted the working class made their work of only limited use. As the proletariat became conscious of itself as a class waging a war against their bosses and the state, the utopians clung to the hope that their hyper-rationalized blueprints of the future would color across class lines. I think there's a risk that today's utopias are being written in a similarly kind of unreflective way by those whose job it is to publish radical books with radical publishers, or to advance non-reformist reforms in urban design and environmental policy. That's not to say that it's wrong for those of us who can to busy ourselves with post-capitalist imaginaries, but it is to say that our capacity to do this suggests that we're at a specific stage in the struggle's development. After decades of capitalist realism, we should welcome this newfound ability, but this ability immediately introduces a new problem. Under capitalist realism, our imaginations were constrained by the capitalist horizon. Under capitalist catastrophism, the gap between what we can conjure in our mind's eye and our concrete conditions of struggle can confront something formidable or even insurmountable. In a repeat of the problem that Paul Matic outlined in his classic text, Spontaneity and Organization, we find ourselves caught between what is imminently winnable in the here and now, and where, with ever-increasing urgency, we know that we need to be. So that's the first mutation of capitalist catastrophism. The second, the future is cancelled. Okay, so this has to do with Fisher's idea that European culture has struggled to invent fundamentally anything new under capitalist realism. And I have to specify European here because one of the things I take issue with in Fisher is his inability to break with Eurocentric patterns of interpretation and critique. Try as we might, Fisher felt that the West was incapable of inventing new genres of music, new fashion trends, new cinematographic forms, or new literary genres. Instead, we would recycle, we'd montage, we'd hybridize, we'd write unsatisfying sequels and reboots. We're all familiar with this. Under capitalist catastrophism, it's still the case that the future is cancelled in this sense, but whereas Fisher saw the slow cancellation of the future as primarily a cultural phenomenon, I think it's increasingly political. And whereas for Fisher, the cancellation of the future didn't mean its literal cancellation, for many across the world today, the future really is going to be cancelled. So capitalist catastrophism is characterized in part by crises like the coronavirus or climate breakdown that are not immediately economic in origin, but that nevertheless throw a cog in the gears of capital accumulation. Mainstream economists like to call these exogenous crises. They're crises that are said to arrive from outside of the capitalist system and disrupt the otherwise smooth functioning of supply and demand. The likelihood of such spillovers are exponentially increased by what Jason Moore calls capitalism's organization of nature. That is the way that capitalism tears into, degrades, destroys, recomposes, and redistributes the natural world. Biologist Rob Wallace and his co-authors have shown the direct connections between industrial agriculture's circuits of accumulation and pandemics like the coronavirus. What passes for common practice in agribusiness, things like deforestation, the forced displacement of local populations, monocultures, genetic selections, creates near perfect conditions for novel viruses to multiply and spill into human populations. This means that the pandemic is as much a product of global capitalism as the screens that we're talking through. Like the climate crisis, it's an argument against capitalism, an argument against the European model of development that for Deutsche Bank passes as progress. In 1961, Fanon explained that Europe's very way of life was what he called a scandal, for it was built on the backs of slaves, it fed on the blood of slaves, and it owes its very existence to the soil and subsoil of the underdeveloped world. In the colonial period, this oppression took the form of immediate acts of violence wrought upon the minds and bodies of the subjugated. After decolonization, and in the neoliberal period that Fisher described in his work, the exploitation of the global south took more mediated and subtle forms. As Utsa Pratnik and Prabhat Patnik have argued, violence was no longer exercised by force, but through the arbitrating power of the market. Wages in the global south were deflated to protect the price of Western currencies while ensuring a constant flow of raw materials and food from the world's poorest countries to the richest countries. This, it was claimed, was the only realistic way for the global south to develop. In contrast, I think capitalist catastrophism, still an emerging and ascendant formation, is going to be characterized by a return to immediate forms of violence and subjugation inflicted on the world's surplus populations. As the uneven and combined crises of the coronavirus and climate breakdown and declining profitability loosen capitalism's hold on what it means to be realistic, the imperialist core drops all pretense of win-win scenarios for the core and periphery in return to a strategy of social and ecological plunder. So this progress is still in its early days, but I think already the result has been a kind of bio-apartheid, which is an important precursor to what the UN predicted. They predicted a thing called a climate apartheid or an eco-apartheid, where the lives of European citizens and the wealthy in particular will be put before the lives of the global south. In the interest of time, I'm just going to give a few quick examples of this. So recall that in the early months of the pandemic, US and Europe drove down the prices of COVID-related medical equipment while placing export controls on much needed ventilators, face masks, gloves, and gowns, leaving the periphery without the supplies it needed to combat the spread of the virus. In December last year, the World Trade Organization held a vote about whether or not to waive patents on COVID vaccinations. Waiving them would ease important technology transfers and give countries in the global south the opportunity to quickly and affordably produce vaccines. Keeping patents in place would make money for pharmaceutical companies in the global north by risking the lives of those in the global south. The vote was a forceful reminder that we still live in a world defined by a capitalist core and periphery. A near arrow straight line can be drawn across this map depicting the results of the vote. Countries in the global north voted to keep the patent in place. Countries in the global south, with the exception of Brazil, voted for a patent waiver. Numerically speaking, more countries voted for a waiver, but the WTO is not a democracy, and the north won. But I need to muddy these waters a little bit, this kind of north-south divide that I've been working with. The future is also counseled for the core's internal peripheries. Those essential workers or low-paid service sector workers, often racialized, who are subject to the coercive force of state violence, and for whom access to the core often becomes conditional on employment. Recall how the UK imported cheap Eastern European labor to work our fields when all international travel was banned, or how BAME communities are more at risk of dying of COVID or the polluting effects of fossil capital. 99% of London currently exceeds World Health Organization air pollution limits, but BAME communities are exposed to the highest levels of toxins and pollutants. All of this is a pale imitation of what we can expect as capital's expansion drags us unwillingly into a warming world. A recent study found that by 2050, up to 1.2 billion people could be displaced, their homes made uninhabitable by searing heat. Yet in February 2020, Germany announced that it would not consider applicants from so-called climate refugees. It's likely that most of Europe is going to follow suit. In the meantime, authors like James Lovelock and Anatole Lieven are laying the groundwork for a natalist Fortress Europe-style climate mitigation strategy, while supposed environmental champions like David Attenborough are advancing Malthusian arguments about population control. In his book, The Vanishing Phase of Gaia, Lovelock openly endorses racialized and eugenicist immigration controls. Here's a quote from him. "To the refugees, we are their lifeboat, but the captain and officers of the ship have to decide how many we can take, who can be allowed to board, and who must remain to take their chances. Fairness suggests a lottery, but common sense rules out such a simple selection. The sick, the lame, the old would have to stay behind and take their chance, along with passengers who felt called upon to help them." He then goes on to speculate about the ratio of men and women that would be most advantageous for the core to accept. Under capitalist catastrophism, then, the imperialist core doubles down on its exploitation of internal and external peripheries, while shrouding that violence in the ideological garb of doing whatever it takes, in Rishi Sunak's words, to protect Europe's citizens and the planet. So that's my second mutation. The third, capitalist realism is a class project. For Fisher, capitalist realism was a neoliberal class project. As he saw it, our inability to imagine the end of capitalism was the effect of what he brilliantly called libidinal dampening. That is, the suppression of our collective desire for something fundamentally better than what capitalism can offer. But because Fisher understood neoliberalism as a class project conducted by individuals, his thinking around capitalist realism was often, I think, excessively functionalist. Capitalist realism was seen as a kind of will of neoliberals made manifest, a total and insidious, near intractable exercise in political, economic, and libidinal engineering, orchestrated by a clique of near-omniscient and omnipotent technocrats. But if this assessment were ever true, I don't think it's true today. The coronavirus and climate crisis have revealed that there is no group or class instrumentally shaping history. There are only competing capitalist states and competing capitals, vying for scraps of profitability or rentier assets like land, housing, and digital platforms in an economy defined by enduring secular stagnation and underemployment. It's because capitalist class is no longer in control, even nominally speaking, that our situation has become the inverse of what Naomi Klein calls disaster capitalism, the exploitation of a crisis to drive through projects and policies that would never otherwise survive public scrutiny. There's no doubt that we can find examples of what might be called disaster capitalism in response to the pandemic and the climate crisis, but I think there's a qualitative difference in how these function as we move towards capitalist catastrophism. From the perspective I'm advancing here, the problem with Klein's theory is that it presumes there's a normal to return to. Disaster capitalists use crises as smoke screens to consolidate their power for the post-crisis times to come. But what happens when there is no post-crisis? What happens when the catastrophic convergence of capitalist exploitation and ecological degradation lead to what David Wallace Wells calls a climate cascade, a scenario in which natural disasters cease to be discrete events and start to overlap and compound one another in the ways that I've tried to suggest in this half of the talk. The answer, I think, is capitalist catastrophism, the catastrophic convergence of ecological crises, with capital's so far irreversible decline in profitability. Okay, that's kind of the first half of what I have to say. Moving on to land. So my hope is that this idea of capitalist catastrophism can orient our thinking, and in that respect, at least, it's faithful to the impetus behind Fisher's work. So let me shift over to talking about land. I'm going to talk about rural land in particular and use that perspective to kind of level a critique at capitalist urbanization. Land can seem like a strange place to turn after what I've said so far, but I think it's an essential subject to broach for a few reasons. The Marxist and anti-colonialist traditions of thought, the traditions I work in, have a long history of taking the land and agrarian questions extremely seriously. But with the significant exception of indigenous land-back movements in settler colonial states like the US and Canada, the land question has all but disappeared in the global north, and I think in particular in the UK. What I want to do here is reopen the land and agrarian questions on ecological and internationalist grounds before concluding with just a few observations about what a Marxist analysis might add to our discussions of land and how to avert capitalist catastrophism. So let's start with a really general point. The issue of who controls the land, how they control it, and for what purpose is a defining feature of all societies. Already in Homer's Odyssey, it's said that the only fate worse than a lack of access to land is death. But as Keith Tribe has shown, the meaning and importance of land changes across times, cultures, and modes of production. The idea that land is an alienable thing, a thing that one might own as a subject of individual or collective rights, is a comparatively recent invention, dating to around the 16th century and the birth of capitalism. It is a European invention. It is a colonial invention. And on this, I'd urge everybody to read Robert Nicoll's Theft is Property or Brenna Bandar's The Colonial Lives of Property. It's the alienability of land in the form of private and exchangeable property that has made the land and agrarian questions two of the most important issues for modern revolutionary and anti-colonial struggles. And it's worth taking a moment to emphasize just how important it has been to these struggles, since there's a forgotten tradition of thought here that I think needs to be recovered. So Bolshevik revolutionary Bonch-Buvich has this really wonderful story about the evening that the Bolsheviks took power in Petrograd. After a triumphant meeting of the Petrograd Soviet workers and soldiers' deputies, Lenin goes back to Bonch-Buvich's apartment to get some rest. And Bonch-Buvich recounts how he had to persuade an overexcited and overtired Lenin to get some rest. Eventually, Lenin goes to bed in Bonch-Buvich's room, and confident that Lenin is finally asleep, Bonch-Buvich tries to get some rest himself on the apartment sofa, only to be awoken by Lenin sneaking back into the room to get to work at the apartment's writing desk. Lenin writes for hours before sneaking back to bed. That text, the first Lenin writes after the revolution, was the Bolshevik decree on land. In the morning, Lenin shows Bonch-Buvich and his comrades the decree and says that once it's been announced, quote, no power would be in a condition to take the decree away from the peasants and return the land to landowners. It is the most important gain for October Revolution. Lenin well understood that the land question was of the utmost importance. Similarly, in Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon says that the land and not abstract rights to freedom are at the forefront of the minds of the colonized. In his essay, In Defense of Land, Amilcar Cabral says that the best way to defend people is to defend the land. In his book, called simply Land or Death, the Peruvian revolutionary Hugo Blanco makes an impassioned case for land reform as the question of revolutionary upheaval, while Jose Carlos Mariátegui says that the problem of indigenous peoples in Latin America isn't principally the right to education, culture, progress, love, or heaven, but land. These are some examples. I could list dozens more. There are, of course, good reasons why thinkers and revolutionaries from this period would prioritize the land question. In the early 20th century, the peasantry was still an important political class. And in classical Marxist terms, the terms used by Lenin and Kautsky, among others, the land and agrarian questions were inextricably linked to the question of the peasantry. The question the agrarian question raised was whether as capitalist relations of production expanded into the countryside, as labor-saving industrialization transformed the organic composition of agricultural production, the peasantry would be absorbed into the circuits of capital as a new rural petty bourgeoisie and urban proletariat, or whether they could side with the proletariat as peasants in struggle. And it goes without saying that the situation is completely different in Europe today. Europe has a highly productive, industrialized, and capital-intensive petro-farming regime, whereas once the vast majority of Europe's population were involved in one way or another in food production, today in the UK, 72% of our land is farmed, but only 1% of people are directly employed in agriculture. Enclosures, the brutal suppression of peasant rebellions, and industrialization have proletarianized the peasantry and urbanized the population, hollowing out the countryside in the process. So it could therefore be said that the UK and the rest of the capitalist core has solved the classical agrarian and land questions. Food is cheap, which means that labor is cheap, people are on the whole well-fed, and agricultural labor has been reduced to a minimum by all kinds of technological advances in agriculture and global supply chains. In fact, even in the global scale, the vast majority of agricultural laborers now produce, at least in part, for an international capitalist economy. It seems that the global peasantry has been absorbed into capitalist production. It seems that the land and agrarian questions are settled. Notable Marxist scholars like Terry Bayers and Henry Bernstein have taken that position. But in an important sense, none of that's true. So scholars including Sam Moyo, Paris Yaros, Pravin Yar, and Utsa and Prabhat Patnaik have rejected this narrative on the grounds that it neglects to mention the persistent neo-colonial and imperialist organization of land and agriculture at a global scale. As Moyo and his co-authors put it, the land question wasn't solved in the UK, it was exported. First to slave plantations, then to colonies, then to neo-colonies, held in a subordinate position by the cause domestic agricultural subsidy regimes, export-orientated global development programs, and international currency controls. Even otherwise astute Marxist scholars miss the historical and conjunctural importance of this. Colin Duncan, for instance, argues that English agriculture attained what he called its light industrial prime in the customary agricultural knowledge, four-field rotations, and a precarious balance of class interests in town and country are said to have enabled improvements in agricultural productivity without the detrimental ecological effects of industrial inputs. According to Duncan, this, quote, curious ecological balance was observed at least until the advent of coal and steam associated with factory production. And apparently it suggests a viable way of returning to ecologically benign practices of land management and food production in the capitalist core. But there's a huge problem with this story. Revised figures of per head agricultural output for the period suggest that output declined between 1750 and 1800 and remained stagnant between 1800 and 1820. This shortfall was made up by Britain's slave plantations and colonies, something Duncan fails to mention. By 1800, the colonized Irish population, who were suffering under heavy rents and taxes, contributed 11 to 18% of England's entire consumption of meat, butter, and wheat. Patnaik argues that most of Britain's urban consumption at the time came from imports from the colonies. So the UK's process of urbanisation and industrialisation was not an endogenous affair, as Duncan suggests. It was fueled principally by large-scale imports of food and raw materials from Ireland, the West Indies, the Americas, and India. Such imports were essentially costless for the empire because they were paid for by colonised producers out of their taxes and rents. The cheap imported food reduced the need for agricultural labour, reduced labour costs, and increased profits, all of which were essential to the process of industrialization and urbanization. Still today, a large number of perishable goods, including fresh fruit and vegetables, coffee, tea, minerals, animal feed, seafoods, and flowers, are acquired from the fields and seas of developing countries. Agribusiness often enter into direct contracts with small farmers to access land for European consumption. By super-exploiting semi-proletarian labor in the South, these companies record huge profits in their registered countries. Hence, the case we all know, that family farm-produced ethical coffee that's available in our coffee chains today. John Smith has shown that labor arbitration and super-exploitation enabled a markup on coffee as high as 429% between the year 2000 and the year 2009. These profits are recorded in the GDP of the global north, with only a paltry sum recorded in the coffee's point of origin, and then a smaller sum still going to the producers. So the agrarian and land questions in the West and in the UK haven't been solved. They've been displaced onto the lands and workers of the global South. At the same time, new agrarian questions have emerged, most pressingly the anti-ecological character of industrialized agriculture. Globally, agriculture, forestry, and land use are responsible for 18.4% of all CO2 emissions. That's considerably less than the 73.2% of emissions from energy. But when we consider that the agricultural sector and its supply chains are heavy consumers of fossil fuels and fossil fuel byproducts, or when we consider other forms of ecological destruction associated with the industry, such as poisoned water systems, species and habitat loss, deforestation, the risk of zoonotic spillovers, water basin depletion, and soil erosion, we can begin to see that we need an entirely new system of food production and land management at a global scale. British pork and chickens, for example, are in part fed by soybean cake or soy meal, the point of origin of which will have all likelihood been a deforested monocultural soy plantation in the Amazon rainforest, worked by itinerant casualized labor. That soy crop will in turn have been fertilized, as you see in this picture, by phosphates extracted from massive mines in central Florida and elsewhere. All of that is to say that we need to think relationally and internationally from the beginning. The UK's land question is the global South's land question, while the now months-long Indian farmers' protests or ongoing land occupations across Africa and Latin America need to be seen as the displaced, mediated form of appearance of the UK and capitalist cause land and agrarian questions. This means that we need solutions to the fossil capital-reliant industrial agriculture of the UK and our excessive urbanisation, but at the same time solutions for the global South. Our goal should be to rapidly decarbonise our economy while freeing the lands of the South from export-driven production. So this is a huge problem, and I cannot possibly pretend to resolve it today. There are also communities, scholars, and organisers who are much better suited to answering it than I am. So what I'm going to do instead is conclude with a few remarks about how Marxist agrarian thought might contribute to those discussions. What I want to do is try and push against the limits of capitalist catastrophism and envision ways of moving from our anti-ecological condition into something that is not just ecologically benign, but that is ideally ecologically and socially restorative. So a Marxist response to the land and agrarian questions has two closely related elements: land reform and the overcoming of the distinction between town and country. But as I'm aware I'm running out of time, I'm going to stick with land reform, and we can talk about the division of town and country in our discussions. So Marx argued, and I'm quoting here, that the soil is the original source of all wealth and has become the great problem upon the solution of which depends the future of the working class. For Marx, all capitalist profits and all socially necessary use values are ultimately the products of the admixture of human labor with what he called the free gifts of nature. It followed that the land ought to be a common asset, a thing held in common and managed in common in the interests of all humanity, not only those living, but also those future generations to come. Marx therefore warned against, quote, allowing a few individuals to regulate the land according to their whims and private interests, or to ignorantly exhaust the powers of the soil. Unfortunately, this is precisely what has happened in the UK and globally. As Doreen Massey puts it, land is the form of wealth that is the least wealthy have the least access to. In her study of land ownership in the UK, Massey recounts how between 1972 and 1974, the value of land rose by more than £50 million, which was the equivalent to the country's entire GDP at the time. Guy Shrubsole's more recent study of English land ownership finds that the value of land has increased fivefold since 1995. 2/3 of England's land is owned by just 0.36% of the population. More than 30% of the land is owned by neo-feudal land barons, the aristocracy, and the monarchy, while around 17% of England is owned by hedge funds and speculative investors. As profitability declines in productive industry, money is increasingly moving into land as a speculative asset and as a source of rent. This is a symptom of the secular stagnation that Deutsche Bank worries about. It's a symptom of capitalist catastrophism. Things are only getting worse. In his book, The New Enclosure, Brett Christophers exposes the vast scale of public land sell-offs by local councils and national governments since 1979. Over the last 40 years, 2 million hectares, or 10% of the entire British landmass, has been privatized. Today, councils are forced to sell assets, sometimes for as little as £1 to corporate developers in the hope of raising their tax base and filling budgetary deficits incurred by the Conservatives' austerity agenda. The result is that rather than the land serving common social and ecological goods, it serves the interests of private individuals and speculators. So the Marxist answer to this is fairly simple, if not incredibly difficult to implement: land reform. Speaking to the Manchester section of the International Working Men's Association in 1872, Marx called for land nationalization and its collective democratic management. I'll leave this quote here, I'm not going to read it in full to you now. So in his discussion of this speech, in this section in particular, the Italian communist Amedeo Bordiga notes that Marx is using the idea of nationalization as a rhetorical device to reach out to workers who might not yet be convinced by the need for socialist land reform. For Marx, it's not enough that the land is publicly owned by the state, nor would it be enough for the land to be owned and managed by rural or urban cooperatives. Rather, the land of a given country, and ultimately all land globally, ought to be managed democratically by the totality of human society. Only then would the value form be abolished, and only then would the impersonal domination of capital and its degradation of nature cease to exist. Okay, so in 1872, Marx was arguing that the deterioration of the soil and the exploitation of labor made land reform what he called a social necessity. I think this is truer today than ever. The UK's Commission on Climate Change has argued for years that little can be done to reduce agricultural emissions in particular without a change in how we produce our food and manage our land. Yet their solutions and the solutions of parliamentary parties either play around at the edges of our agro-industrial system, maybe by incorporating cover crops or by green manures, or they hope for as of yet non-existent eco-modernist techno-fixes. That's things like hydroponics, vertical farming, or lab-grown meat. But I think if we're willing to think bigger, if we're willing to imagine bringing the land back into collective control in various ways, then there are at least 6 things that we can do that are socially and ecologically regenerative and that would make a real difference. So I'll end with my six things. The first, grow more of our food domestically and closer to where we live. Numbers vary, but at the moment, the UK only produces around 50% of its food. Just 15% of the UK's agricultural land is used to grow crops for human consumption. Only 3% of our land is dedicated to fruit and vegetables, and we produce only 12% of our total fruit consumption. Land could be freed for food production by reducing the amount of land given to cereal production. Cereal currently occupies 50% of the UK's arable land. Second, we can dramatically reduce our meat consumption. I know this is an easy one and we're all familiar with it, but even the most efficiently and locally produced animal proteins are orders of magnitude more carbon intensive and polluting than plant protein. At the moment, 22% of our arable land is used to grow feed for livestock. Reducing our meat consumption would free some of this land for horticulture and grains for human consumption. Third, we can reverse the sell-off of county farms. These are farms owned by local authorities that are meant to ease the access into farming for people who don't have the large amounts of startup capital that are usually required. But between 1966 and 2013, 10,000 county farm holdings were sold to private investors. Shrubsole found that the number of county farms has halved in the last 40 years, and that the sell-offs are increasing because of the austerity agenda. If the land were under common ownership, county farms could play an integral part in reimagining the countryside. I think they could do at least 3 things. 1, they could open the countryside to traditionally excluded and often racialized communities. 2, they could serve as hubs for education in conservation and sustainable land management. And 3, they could become a place for experimenting with restorative agricultural practices. Fourth, we can produce more of our food in urban locations. Rooftop gardens, community allotments, urban farms, and guerrilla gardening can all bring food production back into the city. This should be done with the ultimate aim of overcoming the division between town and country. That is, with the aim of de-urbanizing the UK's population. Urbanization, as I've mentioned above, has been driven by the exigencies of capital, not by human needs, and so that process needs to be reimagined and restructured. Fifth, agroecology. After decades of intensive ploughing and fertilizer and pesticide use, the UK's soils are desperately depleted and our biodiversity is some of the lowest in the world. We can restore soil health, sequester more carbon, and reintroduce wildlife by reducing industrialized farming to an absolute minimum. In its place, we should introduce agroecology and agroforestry. This means completely reframing how we relate to nature and agricultural landscapes. Agriculture should be understood as only a small part of a larger process of organizing our metabolism with nature that includes processes like conservation and rewilding. Sixth, finally, common democratic land ownership would allow for planned acts of international solidarity with the global south. the rapid decarbonization of our agricultural and energy sectors would help pay the carbon debt that the global north has accrued for its fossil-fueled industrial development. Democratically and communally managed land and agricultural programs would also open the possibility for knowledge and technology transfers between the global north and the global south. So that's my kind of wish list. But in saying all of that, and doing this intentionally, I'm pushing up against the limits of a trap that I've kind of made of my own making, right? As I've argued, under capitalist catastrophism, we know where we need to be, but not the path to get there. With what social forces can we fight for the kinds of land reforms I'd like to see in the UK? With what organizational forms can we secure our wins and insulate them from state and capital? These are the kinds of questions that I think we need to be asking, that I hope in some way this talk and the idea of capitalist catastrophism helps us to pose. So I'll leave it there, stop sharing my screen, and I'd like to hear what comments and questions any of you have.
Many thanks, Kai, for the lecture today. Yeah, you have given us a lot of stuff to think and digest. Perhaps you can also post in the chat the couple of books that you suggest to read during the lecture. Just before we start with the questions, the way we're going to proceed is if you want to ask a question, you can just use the raise hand function of the Zoom, and we can just open the mic for you. Or you can just also ask questions in the chat, and I can read them for you or on your behalf. Yeah, so well, perhaps you can. There's something. I mean, at some point you describe some issues with the imagination, the Green New Deal, and other forms of a kind of way of imagining the future that are now possible, that are because of the capitalist catastrophism, I understand correctly. So you see this, perhaps is a misunderstanding, what you're suggesting here, the 6 proposals, something that, I don't know, perhaps people like, architects or designers could actually take on board, and imagine those forms of a futures, in which they can be, land can be organized, and perhaps those 6 points will actually be the ones that could actually help to break, the division between town or urban and rural, which I guess, well, being in architecture school, many people are fond on, talking about dense environments, sustainable cities, etc., and will go against to those ones, and they will bring, issues about, this will cause suburbanization, so you misunderstood all this stuff. But do you see that, obviously as a priority, like to create those scenarios, perhaps based on those ideas, to actually help, not only spark the imagination of what this could be, but also to break some of the misunderstanding of, why, because, the main discourse is around, dense packed cities that is more sustainable, that is more kind of suitable to live with, because we're together, we'll spend less. I mean, obviously, with many of the stuff that you describe, it's obviously something that you can explain, but perhaps you can tell us a little bit about, how this could actually help break that impasse.
Yeah, great question. So this is a thing that I'm still chewing over and trying to work on. It's a long-standing Marxist argument that urbanization was driven largely by exigencies of capital, less by the exigencies of where it made sense for people to live, and that it made more sense to live closer to where our food is produced and be more evenly distributed across the crust of the earth, is what Bordego calls it. So I've been inspired by that for a long time and thinking about that partly because of this idea of metabolic rift, which is an idea used by people like John Bellamy Foster. And it's the idea that once you have a condensed urban environment where food production is not taking place, that city is always dependent on some kind of hinterland, some kind of external force, that it kind of draws ecological resources in and uses, and then throws the waste back out, right? Whatever, sewage and all the rest of that. And so, yeah, I've been trying to think, okay, let's take that really seriously. Is that the case? I think it probably is the case. And then how do you imagine breaking down that division in a way, given that, there are conveniences of living in a city, which is why at the end, I was really trying to push against this idea of capitalist catastrophism. Now I've come up with it. Is it wrong? Can I prove it's wrong by doing something that's beyond it and pushing beyond it? And I think one of the ones there that I think is most useful for that is thinking about urban food production, right? So we have very, very few allotments in the UK. They're incredibly hard to get. But I think things like rooftop gardening, things like that, start breaking down that division in ways we can really imagine and that are quite implementable for people who are doing urban design. So if you don't put profit maximization and the spatial efficiency of cramming people into a small place at the top of your agenda, but you put making cities where people can flourish, where people can be close to nature. And I think one of the first things you should start thinking about is making it possible for people to contribute and understand how their food is produced and have that experience. I could go on forever. There's loads of stuff about mental health and how being around trees, for example, boosts your mental health by, orders of magnitude. All of those things should become imaginable for us, I hope.
Yeah. I mean, one of the questions that I start seeing in the chat is regarding that. Like Ryan's story says, how would you propose we change out eating habits if we were to grow our own food? So it's a bit related to what you were just saying.
Yeah.
Perhaps you can add something more if you on that regard. Mm-hmm.
I think so. There's loads of obvious things. We should start eating more seasonally. There's plenty of things we can produce in the UK. They might not seem that exciting, but it makes more sense to rely on seasonal food. Stuff that it's worth, even whatever small space you have, if you're able to grow some of your own food, you get a sense of what's possible. And I think becoming more reliant on fruit and vegetables, becoming more reliant on beans as a source of protein, meat being reduced but not completely taken out of your diet. Those kinds of things, I think, become really easy to imagine. And then things we don't think about so much, like lots of the grain we use in our bread, the wheat, comes from Canada because they have a higher protein content. But that's a massive distance for that to travel when we can grow ancient grains that are perfectly good in the UK. So it's just about restructuring it and imagining what works for our ecosystems and the way we want to live our lives. I'm not kind of imposing these models. I want to talk and think about them. But it certainly makes sense to produce things that we know grow well in the UK and build our diet mostly around that.
Great. Nathan Tanki says, Kai, thanks for the great lecture. The question you posed at the end, oops, there's so many questions that is moving my chat, sorry. The question you posed at the end and I identify as crucial, what social forces and organizational forms are needed to challenge capitalist catastrophism. These are questions that movements both in UK and beyond are grappling with, so far without much success. What are your own views about what the answers look like?
Oh God, that's a difficult question, Nathan.
Yeah.
I've gone through stages on this thinking. I'm kind of at the stage now where that's a difficult thing to be prescriptive about, that these things emerge out of the kinds of struggles that we will see happen organically in response to crises. So I don't think it's easy to just say we need a new left party, for example. Like maybe we do, but actually who does that work and who builds that is almost, it's the same capitalist catastrophism problem comes up. Maybe we need it, but how do we get there? So I'm much more interested in looking at the kinds of organizational forms that are emerging through struggles, the kinds of demands that are being made, and then thinking about how they could be leveraged a bit differently. So things like around the Indian farming protests, these encampments have been set up that are basically like miniature towns and cities that are self-sufficient, that allow those protests to persist, that people like Joshua Clover have started to try and reimagine as a kind of nascent commune. I would like to see something like that emerging in the UK, some kind of collective self-management out of struggle. That's not a satisfying answer, but I'm not, yeah, that's okay.
No, thanks. Shukin, she asked how to achieve a cut in emissions, no? Which is 45% by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050 if we maintain or even increase the agricultural activities. So I guess it's in the type of agriculture, but perhaps you can expand.
Yeah, sure. So the first, most emissions are energy, not agriculture. So the first step, there's a really, really wonderful piece by Stan Cox called, I think it's called Cap and Adapt. It's available on Resilience. And he makes quite a simple policy, which is that you don't create carbon taxes, you don't create carbon credits. This bit's a bit of a leap, but you nationalize fossil fuel infrastructure and you cap the amount of fossil fuels that can be emitted every year, and you ratchet that down until you reach zero. I think something like that seems eminently workable in the energy sector. I would imagine that agriculture would still have some elements of industrialization. There are some things that it's more convenient to do with heavy infrastructure, perhaps, but not all of it needs to be, and other forms of farming are good at absorbing carbon back into the soil, especially given how depleted our soils are. So there's a lot of research being done to show that if you use agroecological farming practices, you can absorb more carbon back into the soil. Or if you do silvopasture, which is like basically having trees and allowing cows to graze between those trees lock in and absorb carbon. So there are loads of answers for these kinds of things out there. I just don't think if you start breaking down and looking at those solutions and thinking of them coming together, then I start finding hope and optimism. Although my talk was very doomy, I think there's some optimism somewhere.
Thanks. I just need to apologize if I kind of miss or jump comments or questions, because there's quite a lot of writing in the chat.
Yeah.
But we'll make sure that we'll send the chat to Kai so he can read them and perhaps answer those. But Gabriel Peck says, Bedor Allegra is theorizing the idea of the interminable catastrophe as a way of thinking of how our ongoing ecological and social catastrophes are the ongoing haunting of plantocratic social relations. How does the plantation and its domination of ground and workers need be centered in how we think about our current conjuncture?
I love this question, and I haven't come across that work, so I'm aware of plantationist scene arguments. I find those very persuasive. I haven't read that particular piece. But yes, there is a haunting of the kind of slave form of agricultural production. That's absolutely true. I also think it's really useful to think about things like our arable or fruit and vegetable growth in the UK. This argument has been made as a kind of plantation logic. It's not the same. I'm not making any comparisons there. But the importation of labor onto mass fields under extremely poor conditions, and then that labor is exported back out. People started to theorize about that as a kind of renovated version or an echo of the slave colonies and slave plantations. And I think doing that, although you have to be cautious about how you do it, really helps you understand how we haven't moved beyond that way of thinking about nature, organizing labor. So it's a productive way to think, and I'll look up that source. Thank you.
Thank you. Mariam Selinger says, thank you for such a good lecture. You mentioned Guy Shrubsole's work, Who Owns England? Have you read the work from Labour, Land for the Many, and where he has been part of? If so, what's your opinion of this work and on the recommendations they offer?
Yeah, I have. A friend and comrade of mine and I wrote a piece recently about Chris Smage's book, Small Farm Future, and we'll be writing another piece engaging with the Land for the Many report directly. One of my feelings about that is that it was this kind of gem of a policy piece that came out of the Corbyn agenda. It has some really fantastic ideas in there, and has now just been lost. And so I really, really urge people to go and read it. Yes, I have a couple of criticisms and questions about some of those policies, but you'll also see that when they write about county farms, they're saying something very similar to what I'm trying to say. So all I would say there is urge people to read it, and wait until I've had more time to think, and I'll hopefully write a piece that engages with some of the criticisms around it.
Thanks. Helen Brown, shouldn't land be taxed rather than production?
Yes, this is a suggestion that comes up quite a bit. There's a guy called Paul Cockshott, a Marxist political economist, who argues that the way out of our predicament is to tax land and to nominally tax the land on a very reduced level for smallhold farmers, but to tax it at a very high level for large-scale farmers. And by doing that, you can start pulling the land back into common ownership. But I mean, I kind of try and avoid that and think larger. I don't want to tax the land because I don't want people to own the land. I think the land is a relation that we have. And that we need to think about land as a common asset that we manage, not a source of profit extraction, these kind of things. Mm-hmm. I know that's a big goal, but we need to think big, I think.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, we have Delia Griswold. Thanks for the generative talk. To what extent is the circumstance of catastrophic capitalism, as you theorize, if not just an insurmountable impediment to executing the proposals you offer, but also, more hopefully, a central component of opening up the political social desire for alternatives and the possibility of understanding that alternatives are not just utopian-driven, but essential and pragmatic in a way that cuts across social differences?
I love that question because it's exactly what I want it to do. On one level, I was very careful to say it appears as if it's an insurmountable impediment, right? The idea of where we need to be and where we are can feel like it's impossible. You can't get beyond it. But I think that is not that true. One of the really interesting things we're seeing is people beginning to put forward active policies and proposals that do push against the limits of that and think in radical ways. So yeah, I hope that it does work as a way to incite that kind of thinking that doesn't leap over the present and into some kind of idyllic utopian future, but that begins to do the difficult work of imagining giving radical futures a content in the here and now. Because I mean, that was how Mark Fisher's capitalist realism has worked for me for years. It was, whether it was true or not, to me, it was kind of like a gauntlet thrown down, a challenge, like, prove me wrong. Is it easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism? And I'd kind of like something similar, if that's at all possible, where it's like, okay, let's show that it isn't an insurmountable thing that we can organize in the present against capitalist catastrophism.
Thanks. Well, some people ask for bibliography. I guess again.
Yeah, I can do that. I should also say thank you for there's all these really amazing links and comments. So I'm going to copy this chat box. There's some really good stuff.
Yeah. Is there anything that can be done to target this change from within the cities and towns, besides a dietary change?
Great question.
That's from Heidi Unat.
Yeah, so I do think if possible, really, really small, I do think trying to grow your own food gives you a new appreciation of what that involves and how it happens. I tried that we've got a tiny garden here that we rent. I tried that last year for the first time and it was not as successful as I would have liked, but it definitely gave me a new appreciation of what's possible. I think stuff like that is really important. Supporting community allotment systems is really important. Depending on what your job is and your role, I mean, I hope urban designers do start thinking about these things and, green cities. I'm aware, Alfredo, you've been involved in some of that work. I think those kinds of things are possible. And in fact, that it will have to come predominantly from the city because more people exist in the city. Yeah.
Thanks. But Oliver wants to ask the question. So if you can just raise your hand in the function so I can locate you, or you can just unmute, I guess you're there. So, yeah, you can.
Thank you. Oh, there we go. Hi, Kai, thanks for that. Wanted to bring in the environmental historian, William Cronon, who's been kind of essential to my work and my dissertation that I'm writing at the moment, who talks about kind of this idea of pristine wilderness and natural beauty and empty spaces being a social construct, and then writes that, to the extent that we live in an urban industrial civilization, but at the same time pretend to ourselves that our real home is in the wilderness, we give ourselves permission to evade responsibility for the lives that we actually lead. So my question is, could changing our understandings of the wild and natural beauty and nature from something kind of abstract and other be part of changing the way we use and understand the land for production and farming? And how could that fit into what you're proposing?
Yep, great question. And thank you, Ollie. Ollie's a former student of mine, so this is nice. Yes, so there's a book I really encourage people to read on this called Nature's Matrix by Yvette Perfecto and a few others. It's basically, there's a long debate in conservation about land sparing versus land sharing that people who were there last week may have heard about. So half earth theory versus this proposal, which is about interlocking spaces of conservation with places where we grow and produce food. And the basic argument is the idea of wilderness that is separate from humanity is non-existent, that idea was often associated with settler colonial politics, settler colonial ways of conceiving of nature, and that, like it or not, we're always producing nature and that we're always in a dialectical relation with nature. And so that we need to reimagine the way we organize nature, in Jason Moore's language, that appreciates that you can't have just a pristine thing over there that's separate from us, and that we're always going to be intervening. We're always going to be doing that. And so it's a question of doing that in the way that's ecologically benign is a term I like to use. So rather than being too optimistic and saying that we're going to be regenerative or restore nature, let's set the bar a bit lower and just not destroy it for a little bit. And then hopefully restorative and regenerative. And the way you do that is by consciously knowing that everything you do is shaping nature. Does that make some sense? So yes, Cronon's brilliant. People should read him. He was really important for me.
Thanks. Yeah, well, there's quite a few comments as well. I don't know if there's more questions in general. Yeah, I mean, one question that I had was about the issue that perhaps was related to what you just talked, the issue of rewilding, no? Like, because, you know, many people, for example, in the Green New Deal here in the UK, like Commonwealth, you know, propose that, no? And obviously there's a kind of definition, I guess, or that what we mean by that, no? And what I mean, what you describe now, no? Like understanding that there isn't something pristine, no, or that, you know, national parks like Yosemite and all the stuff that were created, basically getting rid of Native Americans, is again a social construct, no? So I guess there is some work in developing that definition. For example, in a country such as UK, no. I mean, as you mentioned, more than 70% of the land is just, you know, agriculture, no, and so there might be out there, not only in the UK, but other examples on how to create those examples of, I don't know, interlinking between humans and nature, no? And then avoiding, you know, erosion, et cetera. So perhaps, I don't know if you have examples, people, communities that are working on those perhaps practices that one might call as well, or can fit within, you know, rewilding.
Yeah. So again, I'm going to echo this book again and keep praising it. The Nature's Matrix book is really important for this because, so there's a couple of issues. I think I am a supporter of rewilding, but there are, with some reservations. One of them, rewilding already implies a going back to an originary source of where nature was stable, non-disrupted, ideal, right? So in people like George Monbiot's work, which I find really generative, there's still this sense of nature should look like this. We should have rainforest. This is how the UK should be, right? You'll see that a lot in his thinking. And it's often detached from the way the land is actually managed in the present. So he ends up being very hostile to sheep farmers, for example, when in fact any kind of rewilding that's going to be productive or efficient in the UK is going to have to work with and think alongside the people who live on the land. That just seems common sense to me. So for me, yes, rewilding, but rewilding done in a way that's decided by the people who already live there to make it so that it can happen alongside producing the food, the materials that we need to maintain some decent standard of living. Just seems really important. I'm missing something I wanted to add to that. I'll leave it there. Yeah. So all for rewilding, but I think, yeah, we need, oh, that's it. We need to be careful. The other thing, rewilding in the UK, there's an article that came out 2 months ago about how a lot of landowners are beginning to rewild. So landowners are of a certain class and they're rewilding in their spaces on private land that they can enjoy and that makes them feel good about doing something for all of society. And I just find that detestable. Like, rewilding should be a thing that's done by all of us in a way that advances it for all of us, instead of this being a kind of, at the moment I'm worried it's a form of green capitalism, a kind of ideology about doing something good that is actually anti-democratic fundamentally.
Mm. Yeah. And perhaps, I mean, part of the work that, I mean, some kind of conclusion for me, let's say, for, you know, the program Heron is, because a lot of the, obviously, perhaps you notice a lot of the questions are always projective, no? Like, because the architecture is a field always that, you know, wants to go forward no matter what was behind, no? But I think a lot of the work that we can produce is also about unveiling many of these processes, no? Like, you know, the relation between the global south and north, something that it's, I found it always very kind of, you know, difficult for people to understand, no? Like, you know, and it's so obvious, let's say, well, not obvious, but well, obvious in the question that, well, because the life we live, it's because of the exploitation we produce, let's say, on other landscapes, no? Or the hinterlands, no? It could be seen cities versus rural land, but it can be seen also north versus south, no? And all these things are, you know, now happening, and so that doesn't need to be, let's say, a projective work, but it just need to be a revealing work, no? Like, in the sense of, you know, perhaps with works like yours, no? Or images like images, no? Or visualizations that one can produce, no? Which I think might be also interesting, no? To develop as a form of practice, I guess, no? That wasn't question, just a comment.
No, yeah, absolutely. I agree. I mean, especially for urban designers, one of the things that really haunts my thinking about the city and about the countryside, and I don't know why I'm bringing this up, probably going to hang myself with my own comment, but it's cars, right? Like, this idea of EVs, electric vehicles, how do we reimagine cities without cars is really important, not just because it's a greener and better space, but it helps you think about the practice of living in urban environments differently, and about rural spaces if you get rid of the idea of the car. But also because I think it was 2 years ago, a study was done that said that to replace every car in the UK with an EV, you need more coltan than we're producing globally already. So, like, it's just an impossibility theorem. It can't be done. And so it forces you to think about practice differently by thinking about those ecological constraints. I find that really useful.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. Yeah, I think we have reached the end of today's lectures and comments. I will obviously forward you because there are plenty more that I didn't read, and perhaps I missed some of them because I'm between listening and kind of reading the chat. But yeah, it was great to have you. Thank you very much for, you know, all the ideas that you throw at us, and yeah, hopefully it won't be the last time we'll see you here at the AA. Yeah, so that's it.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for staying. I really appreciate the comments as well. It means a lot. Thank you.